to part 2 in our series of stamp titles for scrapbook pages featuring banana frog stamps. I'm Shamel, and today I'm going to take you through a scrapbook page with a heat embossed title, one of the core techniques of stamping. For this project, you will need letter stamps and a clear block, a clear embossing ink pad, embossing powder, a heat tool with a heat-safe mat, pattern paper or cardstock for your title, a circle punch that's roughly the same size as your letter stamps, a pair of scissors, and a scrapbook page ready for a title. Let's get started. For this title, I'm using the Dominique large letter set from Banana Frog Stamps. This same font also comes in a small size, so you could use the same technique on cards, or you could use a longer title on a page. Remove the letter you want from the clear backing sheet and stick it to your clear acrylic block. Then ink it with a clear embossing ink like Versamark. My Versamark ink pad is quite messy and stained from other projects, but since I'm going to use a colored embossing powder, that won't matter at all. If you want to use clear embossing powder, then you will want to make sure that your ink pad is far closer to pristine than mine. When you stamp with clear embossing ink, you'll be able to see the design just slightly, but it won't be too obvious on the paper. We're after the sticky finish of an embossing ink rather than any color at this point. Do keep in mind that it's important to clean embossing ink off your stamps as quickly as possible, because the longer it gets left on the stamp, the stickier the stamp will remain for pretty much ever. The stamp will still stamp just fine, but it will stick to everything in the storage. So, and that goes for both clear and red rubber stamps. So make sure you take embossing ink off your stamps. I'm stamping each letter on a green pattern paper with tiny white polka dots, and that's from the Girls Papery. Once your title is stamped, you'll want to make sure your work surface is covered, because the next few steps can be a little messy if powder escapes all over your table. Embossing powder comes in a small pot in every color imaginable, so you can pick something that will match your project. Pour the powder grains over the stamped letters and shake off the excess powder. Then just pour it back into the pot for next time. If you find the little pots are too difficult to refill, you can decant powders into small plastic containers like you would use in the kitchen. And then you can just use the powder with a spoon rather than having to dump it out and put it back in each time. But I actually don't mind the jars, and I like that they don't take up very much space, so I just cope with funneling back into the jar when I'm done. Once your powder is put away, make sure you're working on a heat-safe surface, because we're going to use the heat tool to melt the powder. For a title like this, I leave all the stamp letters on the full sheet for this stage, because it makes it much easier to keep the paper in place without any worry of burning my fingers. If you're new to a heat tool, do have a little patience. It's best to keep the heat tool several inches away from the paper. Sure, the powder will melt really quickly if the heat source is really close, but the paper will also buckle, and it may even scorch or burn. It's better to have more distance and wait just a few seconds longer, because you'll get a more even finish in your powder. If you watch the powder, you'll see it go through a quick melting process. It'll start as grains, and then it'll go through a bit of bubbling, and then it'll have a glossy finish to finish at the end. When you can't see any more grains, then you know you're done. Leave the paper to cool for just a second, and then grab your circle punch. Turn the punch over so you can see where you're punching, and position the punch over each letter to make a perfect cutout, nice and easy. Of course, some of the letters may be too tall for your punch, like the T in my title, so just use another shape for that letter. I cut the T into a rectangle with my scissors. It was really easy, and the end result gives it a bit of variety on the page. Now I'm going to move over to my almost finished scrapbook page and make sure the title will fit before I stick anything down. The rectangle for the T is just a bit too big, so I trim that down, and then it all fits into place. I like to add a bit of finish to the edges of all my punched and cut out pieces, so I just brush on a bit of brown distress ink all around the edges. Then it's just a case of adhering each letter into place. Because you're smarter than me and not scrubbing upside down, you will also do things like get your letter T facing the right direction. But I'm using American Crafts adhesive for this step. You can use any standard scrapbook glue you like, and you can use pop dots or foam tape if you'd rather the title stand up off the page for a bit of dimension. You'll notice in just a second I did turn that T around. And that's all there is to it for making an embossed title. Here's the finished page. The great thing I love about heat embossing is that it's a technique that can stand alone like this, or you can build on it by adding more steps to the process. And we're going to feature some of those techniques in other videos in this series. So I hope you'll stop by again for our next tutorial video and try out your Banana Frog stamps. Thanks for watching!